Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar, or webinar today on Email Marketing 101, and also getting the best out of email in a down economy. This is Craig Stouffer with Pinpoint Email Marketing, and I'm joined by Carl Diaz of Net Prospects. First, before we get started, just a few administrative items. The first is today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on demand by early next week or later today. We'll send out an email with a link and access information. The second is, if you do have questions, please enter them as we move along. We'll try to do our best to make this interactive, and we'll work with the questions and work some of the questions in as we move along as possible. The other thing we'll be doing with our follow-up on the webinar and the link information is we will include a summary of the Q&A. So if we don't get to you on screen, don't worry. We will, we will at least summarize that, and we'll include the Q&A as a separate link that you'll have access to with the webinar on demand. For attending today's webinar, you're eligible for a joint offering between Net Prospects and Pinpoint. What we'll do is Net Prospects will be providing a trial account with up to 400 contact records, and Pinpoint, who's an email service provider, will set up a Pinpoint email marketing account and upload those contacts for you if you like, and provide 2,000 email credits. So basically what you can do is get some contacts from Net Prospects, load them into our email system, test out our email system, test out the Net Prospects list together for your specific needs. In our case, we include all the the statistics on open rates and so on and so forth, so you can see how good the list is and how successful it is for you. With that, I'll hand over the first part of the presentation to Carl Diaz, who's Director of Sales and Marketing with Net Prospects. Carl, over to you.
Thank you, Craig, and thanks to everyone for joining us today for our webinar. We're very pleased to be bringing you today's event in conjunction with our partners at Pinpoint. And we'll jump right into the presentation. If we could go to the next slide. Our agenda today, we will take a look at the Can-Spam Act and talk about some of the requirements involved with the Can-Spam Act and how to stay compliant, and also some misconceptions about the Can-Spam Act and some things that many people think you cannot do or prohibits marketeers like us from doing. We'll talk about some easy do's and don'ts for email marketing. We'll review the value of HTML email versus text and do a comparison. We'll talk about different list sources and ways that you can acquire sources of data or emails for your campaign. And then we'll end with a Q&A. And again, I invite you to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll do a brief overview of Pinpoint and Net Prospects as a service. So a couple of things to consider, and we think about the B2B email marketing world. Forrester Research says that about $250 billion of B2B spend will occur in 2008 as a result of email marketing. The research group did a survey of marketeers and came back with a result of 79% of marketeers reporting email as having the best ROI out of their marketing arsenal, even beating out web search. Additionally, 78% of marketeers polled anticipated an increase in email marketing for 2008 in terms of budget. And this is a really interesting point. 58% of marketeers are now using purchase lists to complement their opt-in lists. And this is a really important or very telling statistic. And that is that 50% of B2B companies are now using email to prospect for new customers. So no longer are B2B companies simply using email in perhaps, say, a newsletter form to stay in touch with their existing customers or clients, but they're actually using email as a vehicle to acquire new customers. And I think that's a very telling statistic at 50%.
Hey, Carl, I'll jump in and add, too. The research group report is also available, so if folks send us a note afterwards, either to you or to me, we can make the link available for that research group report that covers some of this marketing information.
Okay, great. Also to that, I would add, there's a resource called Marketing Sherpa that has tons of great articles and information on marketing in general, but specifically in regard to email. A lot of detailed thoughts and trends are on there, and I would encourage you to, if you haven't seen that website, to pay it a visit, or maybe put it in your your schedule of websites to visit and stay abreast of current trends. So, the Canned Spam Act. And the Canned Spam Act keeps a lot of people, I think, from using email as a vehicle for driving their business. Specifically, I'm speaking in regard to business-to-business email. And there's an old thought that basically says you can't send an email unsolicited to someone because it's a violation of the Canned Spam Act. And I only speak in regard to business-to-business email, not in regard to consumer. The content of today's event, again, is focused on business-to-business emailing, not business-to-consumer. And the Canned Spam Act requires requirements for commercial emailers. The Canned Spam Act of 2003, controlling the assault of non-solicited pornography and Marketing Act, establishes requirements for those who send commercial email, spells out penalties for spammers and companies whose products are advertised in spam if they violate the law, and gives consumers the right to ask emailers to stop spamming them. And there's the link to the FTC site. I would encourage you to pay that a visit and educate yourself on those laws, or on that law. But in regard to business email marketing, there are really 4 provisions that we need to be very conscious of as marketeers. And the first is the Canned Spam Act bans false or misleading header information. And what that means is the from information of your email and some of the IP information that can be included in there. There have been instances, I guess, where people have been able to create false IP addresses or hijack URLs of other businesses and use them, excuse me, as sort of a from in a fraudulent way. So you need to be forthright in regard to your header information. Number 2, prohibits deceptive subject lines. Quite simply, your subject line needs to be representative of the body or content of your email. Number 3, requires an opt-out method for recipients. And this is where I think a lot of people go afoul, where they either don't have a remove method in place or they don't follow up and are not proactive in removing individuals from their list that no longer want to receive emails from them. And I believe the provision in the law is you have 48 hours to remove an individual who requires or replies that they want to be opted out from your list. And I would rate that as the most important point of the 4. And then lastly, requires that unsolicited commercial email be identified as an advertiser and includes the sender's physical postal address. I would also add to that phone number, and I would also add to that a link to your privacy policy if you have one. That's, I think, just being a good corporate citizen, including that these days, will provide a good level of peace of mind and validity to your marketing piece.
In fact, Carl, that's a good point to bring up. We've actually found that across our customers, B2B customers, that the response rates go up notably, measurable amount if companies put in a link to their privacy policy in their correspondence. So, good point. The other thing, too, is on the opt-out methods. Although the law states that, to your point, it's a longer time period, of course, we recommend best practices, as you would too. Best practices would be use the system that's going to remove opt-outs immediately. And I think most email systems, and certainly our email-hosted system, as soon as somebody clicks on that link, they're opted out from the list immediately. So there's the legal aspects, and of course the B2B, the best practices would be to remove immediately.
Great point. Thank you. Also, here's another link to the FTC site and some toll-free numbers you can use. I would encourage you to do so. It's your tax dollars that are paying for it, so take advantage of that resource. Okay, so 10 quick do's and don'ts for B2B email marketing. First, we'll look at some don'ts. And there are some very obvious ones. Excessive punctuation or capitalization. Most companies these days have spam filters of some sort or another, and in general, spam filters score incoming email, and one of the things it looks for, again, is excessive punctuation or capitalization as kind of a red flag. Second to that would be some catchwords. The word free is really a no-no. I think that's a glaring and obvious word to stay away from, and kind of indicates an incoming email as probably very spammy. Don't use long URLs. Use hyperlinks. It's a very simple method of essentially hiding or covering up a URL with a word that you can simply click on to take a customer through to a landing page or to an offer. Don't send one big image or one big picture. Reason being, many people simply have their email browsers set up to view text only. So if you're sending a JPEG that may have some words in it, or essentially a picture of what would have been a text message, it'll just come across as blank or empty, so stay away from that. Excessive use of the word click here, especially in capital letters, I would say use that sparingly, but do feel free to use it. Next point is minimize and avoid consumer addresses, AOL, Hotmail, Yahoo. From that prospect standpoint, because we provide business data, there are 0 AOL and Hotmail addresses in our database, so that's a non-issue. And my message is that probably any B2B target you're pursuing is not very likely to use a Hotmail or an AOL or a free email address, so avoid those at all costs. Don't use complex or cute HTML. It just complicates delivery, and many people, depending on how their Outlook is set up, simply won't be able to view your message as you would like. And then again, don't ignore those requirements for the Canned Spam Act. They're simple to do. I guess the message is just do them.
Yeah, Carl, I'll add into your, I think it's your 5th bullet point here to add a little more data behind it. The excessive use of click here, especially in all capital letters. So what's actually interesting is we've seen some recent studies by Marketing Sherpa, I believe, in particular, and then also just looking back at some of our own data from across some of our own campaigns. And interestingly, what we've actually seen is whereas sort of best practices before was viewed as going, click here and make it obvious and short and actionable, what we actually find is that if you wanted somebody, for example, to download a white paper, like or to click on, in this case, the webinar, you actually get a better response if you make the entire title clickable. So that becomes sort of the call to action, if you will, instead of just click here. So just a note on that, we're actually finding that gives better results when you put, the entire white paper title, for example, or the event title, and highlight that link as opposed to just the words click here.
I believe we actually did that in the case of today's webinar. If I recall, the emails that were sent out actually did have the title of today's event, Email Marketing 101, as the hyperlink, and it performed rather well. Okay, we talked about some don'ts. Here's some do's. Compelling, interesting subject line. This is absolute paramount. This is your first pass at any potential customers or prospects, is your subject line. And I would encourage you to put a lot of thought into your subject line and actually try to come up with 2 or 3 subject lines and test them. Again, it's your first pass, your first chance to get someone to actually open up your email, which is your goal. So put some good energy into thinking of, again, a compelling subject line. It'll be well worth the effort. Oops. Specific, measurable call to action. Your email should have at least one very tangible carrot or call to action, probably no more than 2. And by this I mean offers. It can become confusing, but what you want to do is definitely have a call to action, some compelling reason for someone to open your email, click through, and take advantage of your offer, your product or service.
Hey, Carl, to just jump in and give a little more information on the 40-40-20 rule, we just have a question that came in on that. So the 40-40-20 rule means, roughly speaking, if you look at where's the value in your email, what are the components in the email correspondence that are the most likely to create somebody or get somebody to interact with you, if you will. And the value, if you will, is created. 40% of the value of your email is really just on the subject line. Approximately 40% is based on the call to action, which can be, what the offer is specifically and the links that you set up to actually, when I say a call to action, the call to action can be either a click on a link or to ask somebody to contact you or whatever, but, for a free offer or whatever. But the point is 40% of the value is on the subject line. That's a tremendous amount. We'll cover that in a little more detail in some of the follow-on slides. 40% on the actual call to action or the offer that you're making. And interestingly, only 20% of the approximately speaking, of the value is on the content and the creative aspects. So kind of keep in mind the 40-40-20 rule.
Thank you, Craig. Here we go. Test, test, test. Goes back to my first point with the subject line. Don't be afraid to come up with two or three, or maybe four different versions of your email that you want to send, and test them and look at the results and see what works best. Again, there's the reward at the end of the day is a successful email campaign. So take the time, come up with 3 or 4 versions, test them, and leverage those results in your final campaign. Personalize where possible. The from subject, sales in this example versus a person's name, certainly an email coming from an individual or a person is more likely to be open than a generic from address. And then also in regards to personalization, if you have the ability to take different data elements, namely a person's name, their title, their company name, and integrate it into the body of your message, you're far more likely to be, your message is far more likely to be received positively. So don't be afraid to use mail merge, to take those things, again, a person's name or company or title, and put it into different points in the body of the email. And I think the lesson here is more personalization is better. Think above the fold. By this we mean the email view that many people have set up on their Outlook will oftentimes provide a view of the top third of an email message. This is a second pass that you get. If you've made it past the subject line and someone's compelled to take maybe a closer look, you want to perhaps lead with your offer or have something very compelling right at the beginning or top of your message to further generate their interest. And think about your own email behavior. How do you view emails and what compels you to open an email or to click through? Stay consistent with your branding and style. Chances are you are going to send repeated messages to your recipient list, and I would encourage you to think about your messaging and how you can possibly keep it consistent. Perhaps it's a color scheme, font, messaging, tagline. There's definite value in repeated, consistent messaging. Hitting a list with the same or similar message 3, 4, 5, 6 times, you'll definitely see a return on that repeated messaging. And the next point, keep it simple. Avoid complicated HTML designs. Again, we, as marketers, we want to be very creative and come up with some very visual, wowing messages. However, technology is working against us, and email filters are kind of set up to minimize that. So try to keep it simple. Track and measure your results. This is really your reward after all your hard work in putting together your campaign and executing it. Look at those results and learn from your past efforts. And then start with a good, clean list and do your best to keep it clean. Data ages very quickly. Try to keep new contacts or adding new contacts to your list all the time. And don't be afraid to clean your list and remove messages or recipients that you know are no longer good.
Hey, Carl, we have a comment in. Somebody provided some feedback, which I was actually going to cover too. So personalization where possible. So this comes in from one of our viewers that said, I switched from info@abc to my name at abc using the send from, and it boosted responses in a campaign by 50%. They said, I think it's because I was not getting caught by so many spam filters. So it turns out that actually may be true. There are 2 issues. One is just on that note, so on the 4th bullet point there, some spam filters might catch you on very generic like sales at or info at, but more importantly, people make a decision as to whether or not to open the email based on, as I said, a couple things: the title, what they see in the preview pane, and then who the sender is. And so sales ad is very generic. You're not developing a relationship, so to speak, with the person on the other end or the recipient. So that data, 50% is pretty high, but we consistently see an uplift if somebody actually uses, or if the customers, email marketing customers use a real name as opposed to a generic name. So interesting that somebody actually wrote in and gave us a real statistic on that.
50% definitely sounds high, but I would believe it.
Yep, definitely an uplift.
I think at this point, I'm going to turn the conversation over to you, Craig. I think this is your section, text versus HTML.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more. Thanks a lot. I'll talk a little bit more about text versus rich HTML. So just to be clear, when I say text, we're talking about whether it's pure text or whether it's HTML that only is rendering a text-based email. So they're not any fancy graphics and cool stuff. It's just basically a text email that's actually implemented with HTML so it can be tracked. So the advantages of sending a text or a straightforward email are it's easy to create and customize and personalize. Text emails should be short and sweet. The downside is it seems boring, and those of us that are marketing folks tend to think, geez, have we done our job if we haven't added some creative stuff in the email correspondence? Rich graphical-based HTML can look cool, at least if you have a good designer. If you have a bad designer, maybe it doesn't. But if you have a good designer, it'll look good. The design teams often think that graphic design is required and it's a must-have. And we'll talk in a little more detail through these next slides and show you that, interestingly, the delivery rates when you go into HTML, and when I say HTML, again, when you start including graphics and images and making it look a lot prettier, if you will, besides having a longer lead time, it reduces the delivery rates. So interesting item. So what I'm going to do is just going to dive into some very specific, these are tactical, but very specific design tips to help you get your HTML emails delivered. Because some people still want to do, some level of HTML email, and so we want to give you some right design tips as you move forward with this. So the first is poor HTML can stop your dialogue in its tracks. So the reason is, there are a couple reasons for that. The first is many real spammers just simply can't code. So they produce crappy code, and that's one of the things that many of the newer spam filters have started to use as a filtering agent, is if the HTML is broken or substantially broken, they'll just simply won't pass it along. One of the other reasons that bad HTML stops is because it turns out that, in particular in B2B, the clients that we use, Outlook 2003, the most prominent, of course, being Outlook 2003, Outlook 2007, Entourage, not necessarily in that order, but you get the point, Lotus Notes. Most of those actually do very limited rendering, and so again, I'll get into a little more very specific detail here in the upcoming slides. But the point is, they're not as as flexible or powerful, if you will, in rendering HTML as a web browser is. So the point is, if they get bad HTML, they may not render the email, or it may not render properly, and so that's one of the other reasons why spam filters will filter that out. So again, that drives the keep it simple and keep it correct. Don't cut and paste from Microsoft Word or Publisher. So specifically what I mean is, whatever system that you're using to create your email campaigns, whether you're using an email system like a Constant Contact or a Pinpoint, or whether you've got a separate design team and you're sending them from Outlook manually in lower volume, whatever you're doing, here's a key tip. Don't create your emails and then cut and paste the text from Word, because Word will create a bunch of extra stuff and garbage, and I hate to say garbage, but anyway, a lot of extra font information and so forth that just isn't necessary, and in fact, that will break some email clients. So the point is, when you're doing your development, it's perfectly okay to kind of do your mock-up or your basic set in Microsoft Word, but what I would do then is either cut and paste into text, like into a notepad, and then cut and paste that text in and then recreate it in whatever your item and whatever your email editor is, or just do it directly in the email editor. So key point, I've seen emails that customers have created that have been literally 2 or 3 paragraphs, and they've ended up being 4 to 6K of content because there's a bunch of other stuff that's getting in there when they've cut and pasted from Word. Size matters. When you send an email, whether it's HTML or text, when you send an email, the maximum width that you should expect to display is between 600 and 800 pixels. Even though most of us today, or many of us today, have wider screens, I know mine is 1900 by 1200, the typical preview panel that people use is still only between 600 and 800 pixels wide. And in fact, in some of the consumer addresses like AOL, it's an even more narrow display. So the point is, you want to keep it between 600 and 800 pixels. The other thing which Carl touched on earlier is you want to monitor your image to text ratio. Now, I've had questions come up in the past. There isn't an ideal ratio. I can't tell you that 67.5% is the trigger point for a spam filter. But basically, the reason that this came up is, if you roll the clock back perhaps a year or so ago, initial versions, or 2 years ago, initial spam filters would filter on heavily on the spam keywords, right? That some of the ones that Carl mentioned earlier. And so what spammers figured out is, hey, I'll just send an image, and they create a single image, and they put whatever spam words they want or promotions they wanted, and it just comes across as one big physical image. And there's two problems with that. One is, because that was the technique that spammers used, a lot of spam filters will now look, and they have different settings. But if you have a very high ratio of images and a very low amount of text in your actual email, they'll get filtered because of that. And again, I can't tell you what the ratio is. It depends on spam filter, varies from one filter to another, but you just don't want a huge image to text ratio. And then the other reason, which I'll demonstrate in one of the next slides, is if you don't use your alternate text correctly, most browsers, especially in a B2B environment, email browsers rather, in a B2B environment, by default will have images turned off. So what will happen is the customer, if you don't do it right, the customer will see just a big box with a red X that just has some text on it. So anyway, the point is you want to really monitor your image to text ratio. Length matters too. So when I say length, I mean specifically the length of the title. Currently, the length of the email also will be important, but the length of the title is good. Short is good. You want your titles, the sweet spot is about 50, maybe 60 characters tops. Marketing Sherpa, I know, I recently saw a survey that they did, research they did, which is very interesting. It basically showed that they did a series of tests where they had the email title was between 50 and 60 characters, and another one that was, I think, about 80 characters. And all things being equal, identical content, just made a longer title. The one with the longer title had a fall off in response by almost 50%. So it's a huge fall off. So that's consistent with some things just approximately that we've seen across our clients. So you want to keep it reasonably short. 5 characters is probably too short, 1 or 2 words, but that sweet spot of 40, 50, 60 characters is really what you want to shoot for. As far as the length of the content in the email, that varies. It depends broadly based on the type of correspondence. So if you're sending kind of just a quick update or to make available a white paper or an asset, you want to kind of keep it short and sweet. On the other hand, if it's a newsletter or it's an interactive where you're providing effectively the blog style where somebody who's the voice of your company, so to speak, or the marketing or sales director, for example, or the CTO, is sending their thoughts or correspondence, they're making sort of a personal style, if you will, in their correspondence, typically tying together things like topical areas of interest and then diving into more detail on an educational basis. So that type of an email. That can be longer. That can be 1 or 2 pages long. But other than that, typically you would want a shorter, short and sweet. So there's no magic number, but those are sort of some rough ideas of how you might guide the length of the actual content in your email. Use alt tags for images. I'm going to go through this in the next slide here and show what this is. So if I look at HTML email and using images specifically, as I mentioned, images are usually disabled by default. So you need to think about how your email is going to look to the recipient without images. So this is an email that I found in my delete box. I found it because I saw this. It came in, and I thought I was just too lazy to click the enable images button, and this is all I got. Right-click here to download the pictures. I had no clue what this email was about, and I didn't feel like finding out. This is exactly what happens for most clients is by default, images are turned off, and if you haven't set up the alternate text with the alt tag, the HTML alt tag, which you can check in any of your, if you look at any of your browsers, any of your HTML editors, email editors, they'll show you how to do that. But the point is when you have an image, you want to include the alt tag and include alternate text. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but in this first one where it says right-click here to download pictures, you could put alternate text in here that might have said this text down here, the green list is your venue on it. At least that text would show up. It will still be a box with a little red X in it, but the actual text that you wanted underneath that image will, that image might be relaying, will show up. So at least if the customer has images disabled, they'll get a basic idea of what the correspondence looks like or what it's supposed to do. Okay? So use alt tags. We're not going to go into the details on it here, but check with your HTML editors and browsers, editors and design team, and make sure that they put alternate text on any graphic image that's going to go into your email. Carl mentioned earlier to think above the fold, and again, this is an actual email that I deleted. I found it in my delete box where I was looking for it. When you look in the preview pane of in particular Outlook, right? If you look in the preview pane, the preview the customer will typically see, or recipient will see, is the first 3 to 4 lines of text. And it's usually this information, exactly as displayed on this screen, that the prospect or the recipient will use to decide, should I open this or not? So we've got the from, events. I don't know who the heck events is, so I wasn't interested. The subject was good. It was kind of short. But if you look at the first 3 lines of text, I have no clue. There's absolutely no information in that first part there. So when we say think above the fold, what we mean is think above and think about what the first 3 or 4 lines of your email are going to look like when they get received by your recipient. So, for example, we've seen customers that, and this is perfectly okay, but when they do a newsletter format, the very first piece of content that comes across, right, in their email is they have a header, or their graphic image. They may have their logo or something to that effect across the top of their email. And that's not bad. It's just that you want to make sure that either you be sure that you use alternate text, so if that image isn't displayed, it will at least display the image text. Or if there's something really important, a message you want to get across, then put that initial text in a line or 2 above the actual, the header within your newsletter if you're using that format. Otherwise, again, this is what the recipient sees, not very informative. Avoid CSS style sheets. So, in web design class, everybody learned that you should use, or certainly in the last couple of years, that you should use what are called cascading style sheets, right? Where you take your content and you look at certain styles like font styles and font widths and so forth that you might reuse on a regular basis, and then you pull them out and you create them into a separate style sheet. Or you use that separate style sheet, and then you reference that style sheet in your actual HTML content and web design. So that's best practices in web design. It absolutely, for all purposes, doesn't work very well in email design. I had somebody write in an earlier one that said, yeah, but here's how you can make it work. And you're right, there are tricks to make cascading style sheets work with email clients. But the reality is it's more difficult. It's another potential opportunity to mess something up. And it doesn't always work universally. So the best rule of thumb is when you do your design, actually use inline or embedded styles rather than linking to external cascading style sheets, because that rarely works. And specifically what I mean on that is if you look at the body text or the body tag within your HTML email, what you want to do is you want to minimize, keep things simple, but you want to put your stuff or your design elements, like the font definitions and so forth, in between the body tags. So if you have a font definition, put it in between the body tags, as opposed to referencing an external style sheet. So that's what it means by using inline. Put it directly inline in the HTML. Keep it simple. Try to keep things mostly to like font size, font color, margins, just basic stuff. And then use your body, not your head. The point, again, to stress on that is you put it between the body tags in your HTML email. If there are header tags, like head/head in your actual HTML content, if you look at the actual HTML code, most email browsers today will strip out everything between those header tags, the head/head tags. They'll just completely strip that out. So don't bother putting anything in there. Put any of your style sheet information or anything that you want to put in there specifically between your body tags. Before I pop to this next one, Carl, just check with you real quick. Any questions come in that we should answer, or should I roll forward?
Well, there's actually been a bunch of questions that have been coming in, but nothing that speaks directly to what you just reviewed. Nothing's jumping out at me at the moment, but we will have some good questions at the end.
Okay, great. I just thought I would check. All right.
Thank you.
So I thought I would check here, give you an idea of what to expect and compare results between different types of lists. So net prospects is a purchase list. We have a lot of customers that have even asked, can I even purchase a list and put it into an email system? We've had, questions obviously around, the canned spam implications and so forth. How good is a purchase list versus my in-house list? So we have some real results, and I'll compare these. This is actually for a campaign we did slightly earlier this week, but the numbers are virtually identical, so I thought you'd be interested in this. So actual results from a campaign, we sent out a total of 103,000 emails from the Pinpoint system. And I'm going to compare the actual response rates against different lists as well as the actual cost that comes out when I look at a cost per attendee. So the first is, my first list is an in-house developed list. The second is a purchase list from another vendor, and these aren't necessarily bad statistics. And then the third is a purchase list from net prospects that Carl and I work together on to send invites to you folks. And I'm kind of comparing across the board here. So the first is, what's the bounce rate? The in-house developed list, the bounce rate was 1.1%. Now, by the way, bounces include what we call both hard bounces and soft bounces. And the difference between the two, for those I've had a question come in or two on that, a hard bounce is the email doesn't exist, the domain doesn't exist, the person died, there's no such address. That's a hard bounce, obviously. You're never going to get to them. A soft bounce might be something like somebody's over their email quota, or they, there's an intermittent problem with their email server, so it's a temporary situation. In most email systems, like our system at Pinpoint, what we'll do is if you receive a soft bounce, we'll actually retry that email a few times over the next 72 hours. So we'll try to re-deliver it a few times. And then if that same email doesn't get sent or delivered after, say, 3 email campaigns, then it'll usually be flagged or triggered as being a permanent bounce or a permanent bad.
Is it safe to say, Craig, that a soft bounce is maybe a technical issue? Why an email wouldn't be delivered?
It could be a technical issue, yeah, usually, or again, it can be something as simple as the person simply, they've been out of the office for a few days, maybe they don't have an autoresponder that says, hey, I'm out of the office, leave me alone. But it might be that they just haven't answered their email, and so they've built up over their, the corporation has, or their corporate IT staff has set a limit of 20 or 50 meg in their inbox, and they've overflowed that limit, and so they can't receive any more emails. So that's probably one of the most common that we see. But it's usually intermittent, yeah, technical detail. Okay, so these numbers that say bounces are both hard and soft, so to give you the aggregate numbers. But anyway, so an in-house development list that we've developed through a combination of webinars and events and so on and so forth over the last recent time period. 1.1, when we compared vendor A, vendor B purchased, we got 13% of total bounces with a different vendor. We got 8.9% with net prospects. Now, those are actually good numbers. On one hand, you might think 9%, but that's actually very good. You have to realize that in a B2B environment, okay, in particular, emails turn over and addresses turn over about 2 to 3% every month, just because of people, moving, changing jobs, dying, retiring, whatever combination. So it actually runs about 2 to 3%. There's been some consistent studies, and typically it's 2 to 3% per month. So if a vendor is constantly going through their database and trying to update it, typically it'll take a cycle time maybe of, a quarter or so to get through the entire database. So to have 8 to 10% is actually very reasonable. Again, that factors in intermittent technical details that have nothing to do with, the list vendor. They have to do with the recipient having a bad email box, or a temporary issue with their email box. Anyway, so those are the numbers. Unsubscribes, interestingly, the number of unsubscribes were within a margin. They're all very similar between the different lists. So our in-house developed lists that are people that we've communicated with for 6 or 8 months, in this one campaign we had a total of 0.72% unsubscribes. Well, the purchase lists within a statistical area, they're virtually identical. So that was interesting. I actually would have expected, if I did this result, that the in-house list would be a little bit lower and a purchase list would be higher. But interestingly, they're actually surprisingly similar in these tests. The open rates are very interesting. So we had a very high open rate because people are engaged. And in our case, we actually send from a personal name. Like in my case, I send the invite from Craig Stouffer at Pinpoint. And so you're developing the one-on-one type email send from instead of just saying from Pinpoint. The open rates from another vendor were about 7%, and from net prospects list was 12.3%. I think it's actually a tad higher over time now, maybe 12 to 13%. And depending on how targeted you get with your list, again, those are actually pretty reasonable rates. 42%, I think most people would tell you, was very high. For our in-house list, typically we could see anywhere from 25 to 65%, but 25 to 30% would be a very reasonable level, just as a very big ballpark. Again, there's a huge range of variations, but if you're doing things right, that would be a reasonable return, or open rate rather. An open rate for a purchase list, again, 10 to 15%. You realize you're buying a list, you're trying to focus in on the titles and and segment usually, but still you're going to be reaching people that haven't heard of you and haven't corresponded with you, that may not necessarily initially be interested. So doing a list of getting 12, 13% open rate is actually very good on a purchase list. I'll add to this just another data point, is that if you, for example, purchase a net prospects list and then you send an email correspondence to that entire list, let's say 3 to 6 times over the next 2 months, just approximately for a data point, what you'll actually see is you might see 10 to 12% open rate each time. But if you look at the end of that 2-month time period that I just mentioned and say how many people actually opened the emails over that entire time period, it's typically you'll see anywhere from 25 to 40% will have opened at least one of the pieces of correspondence. So interesting number there. So again, it can be across the board, but those are reasonable ranges to expect.
Can I throw one thing in there, Craig?
Please, please.
One of the things, one of the reasons that the net prospects list probably outpaced, say, a purchase list would be the added value of list segmentation, which is not a topic we talked about really today, but we will do in a future webinar. And by that I mean being able to target your message to recipients that are very likely to be interested in your messaging. And that also would tie back to the low opt-out rate. And so, for example, if you're sending out a message about let's say, a software solution that helps CFOs, and your target list is just that, CFOs, you're very likely to have a very high open rate and a very low opt-out or removal rate. So that, again, list segmentation is another thing to consider.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Thanks for adding that. And then finally, when I looked at the click-through rate, the click-through rate of the in-house developed list was about twice of what it was on the purchase list. But in the next slide, I'm going to give you the actual metrics of what is a cost. So when you look at the actual cost and compare that, the purchase list, our cost per name, again, it varies in volume. Carl can give you a specific quote, but in sort of typical range volumes, it's about 50 cents a name. And if you get into very large volumes, you get down 20, 25 cents a name. We did a reasonably large campaign. So the net is, when I looked at, I need to correct the slide, it was the cost per sign-up. So not cost per click. It was actually cost per person who registered and registered for the event, which is not the same as cost per click. But anyway, that turned out to be $57 to get a registrant to get onto the webinar. Now, again, we'll use that list and have them do other events, right? So we'll continue to bring that cost down substantially when you look at like cost per per sale generated. Ultimately. But again, if you give a rough metric, if I just look at what did it cost if I just use this list one time to get people to show up for the webinar, it was about $57. The time to develop it, Carl and I chatted, we had some stuff, I downloaded a list within 48 hours, got it set up, it was well less than a week, and you can get a purchase list size anywhere from 5,000 to 100,000 plus names. So very quick to be able to start developing and cast a net and then refine it down over time. When I compare that with our opt-in list, the cost per name, when I look at what's the cost for our Google campaigns or the cost to get do a webinar or go to a trade show, and divide that by the number of names we get for a somewhat targeted warm body, the net result is that took months to years to develop a list. It's a much smaller size list, in particular for B2B. And when I look at the cost just for this one event as a comparison, it was 3 times the cost of a purchase list. So it was $168 when I look at the number of people who actually attended the event based on my cost to get that name in the database. And again, the size of list that you can develop, as most of us realize, that's probably why we're on the call here, is it takes a lot longer to develop that list. So there's some real metrics for you. And again, when we make the slides available later, you'll have those available. So final, I guess, point here. Use your purchase list to complement your opt-in list. By the way, we're not suggesting that you do one or the other. It's a good complementary approach. And, of course, keep your lists clean. So you do that through your email program and also by working with a vendor like Net Prospects that does that. Okay, so with that, Carl, we should probably jump through real quick and talk a little bit about Pinpoint and Net Prospects. I've got the slides first, so I'll just give you the quick 2-minute on Pinpoint. What sets us apart? Why should you potentially consider Pinpoint? So Pinpoint is an on-demand hosted email service provider. We primarily service the mid-market B2B companies. And when I say mid-market, I also mean those who are typically doing slightly more sophisticated marketing or need more sophisticated email marketing needs, but they're not really necessarily ready to use and or fund the complex marketing automation systems like an Eloqua and so forth. Very sophisticated, but also very different price level. The product is feature-rich, very easy to use. We have a nice WYSIWYG editor to create your campaigns, very sophisticated and detailed reporting. I'll show you a slide in the next slide rather. And we're probably, well, we're certainly one of the only vendors, because we focus almost exclusively on B2B, one of the few vendors that can permit non-opt-ins in a B2B list from qualified vendors. So that's key. If you go to some of the other vendors, they have an absolute policy that you cannot use a purchase list. And we also provide strategic advice and guidance to improve campaign results. So if you're interested in setting up a trial, please send us a note afterwards. We'd be happy to set that up for you and work with you on that. I just thought I would give you a quick dashboard to give you some idea of the metrics. You can see when you send a campaign, you'll see the total emails sent, the opens, the unique opens, the times, and you can see one of the displays is the histogram of when people have opened on a particular campaign. That's kind of interesting. If you look at the email addresses, we actually display the specific email addresses and exactly when they opened. If you look across the top, we have open stats, link stats, bounce statistics, unsubscribes, and so forth. So this data screen is available for any of those different criteria. And then when we look at delivery and tracking, here's just a high-level overview of a particular campaign where you can see the total number of total opens plus unique opens, the actual open rate, the click-through rate, the bounces, and a nice little pie chart. So the first one was a time-based histogram, and this is a pie chart that gives you the actual percentages of open versus bounce versus unopened. So again, we have all those statistics across, same statistics summary on open statistics, links, bounces, and so forth. So just wanted to give you a quick view of some of the graphics and analysis reporting that we have with Pinpoint. And Carl?
Thank you. Net prospects. What makes us special? There's a couple of key points. The number one most important point, I would say, is the accuracy of the data that we provide. And no matter who you acquire any lists from, the number one question you want to ask is, what is the accuracy of your data? At the end of the day, that's where your results are going to come from. That's going to be determine the success or failure of your campaign. So the number one consideration for net prospects is our accuracy. And statistically, we average 78% accuracy across our database. That includes every data element, including email, telephone, and so on. We do provide email information for approximately 75% of the records in our database. Right now, total, I think we're just shy of about 3 million records. The second real special feature of net prospects is the depth and reach that we have into mid-management. So we're not just providing contact information for the obvious C-level executives, but we have a very deep reach across all functional areas: marketing, HR, legal, finance, operations, at the manager, director, and VP level. Some very often hard to identify, hard to reach contacts. And our information is also very transparent. We publish with each record two very important statistics. Number one is the date at which the information was validated, and second is a competency rating, which is specifically tied to the age of that record. Again, giving our customers full transparency into the age of the information that they are, in fact, licensing or downloading from us. And the database is updated quarterly, and new contacts are added to the database on an almost daily basis. And all of our data comes with a 100% replacement guarantee.
I'm going to jump in there and add too. You know, we've worked with a lot of different databases, and I know in my past life too, I've worked with a lot of different vendors, and I can tell you there are a very small number that actually give you a guarantee. There are a lot of them that are more than happy to take your money and take a list, and you get a 40% bounce rate, and they say, you know, hey, sorry, we don't have a guarantee. We're not going to replace those names. So just a plug for you folks.
That's a good point, and I'll tell you why we do that. And it may sound a little odd, but you know, of course, from a value standpoint, we want our customers to receive the full value of what they've paid for. But in another view, we actually take that feedback from our customers on those failed records, and we take that information and send it off for further validation. Of course, if we can salvage a record or update it, we will. But if a record cannot be salvaged or updated, we'll go ahead and permanently delete it from the database so none of our other customers can come along and download that same faulty record. And that all ties back to our desire to maintain a very concise, highly accurate source of data. And again, about today, just shy of 3 million records covering the U.S. and Canada, about 460,000 companies. These metrics change on an almost daily basis. Again, 75% of which having email, 99% having telephone information, of which 15% you will find will have direct dials and extensions. Our customers are able to search net prospects on things like specific job titles, job functions, and then they can also segment again on that managerial hierarchy, managers, VPs, directors, and so on. And there's a tremendous value in being able to segment your data or target your recipients. And let's see, the next slide. Of course, we can add geographic criteria to our search. We can search on particular company names. And we have a unique feature where we can search on companies by URL. And one of the features our customers enjoy is a self-service sort of match and append feature where they can come to us with a list of up to 5,000 companies and upload those companies into Net Prospects, essentially creating a very defined universe. So imagine you're a salesperson and there are 5,000 companies in your territory that are your target, and you want to reach every VP of HR. Using that feature, you'd be able to create an extremely targeted list of individuals specific to that universe of companies that you've uploaded and within the defined roles or job functions that you've specified. And that's a very powerful feature. Some companies we've been fortunate enough to acquire in our first 2 years of operation. You can see we do very well in the B2B space with any sort of technology, software, or service, namely companies like WebEx, BD Metrics, Citrix, Salesforce.com, NetSuite. These are great companies that we're happy to do business with. We're happy to have as customers. And again, for today's event, or for joining us for today's event, you will each receive a Net Prospects guest account that will include 400 download credits. So you'll be able to go in, have the full search capability of Net Prospects, create, and I invite you to go in and create a very targeted list specific for your own needs, download those records, and then with our partnership with Pinpoint, Craig, they can go ahead and send how many records?
Yeah, what we'll do is if you provide the, if you actually get the trial with Net Prospects, we'll take the list, you just forward it to us. We'll actually have it uploaded. We'll create a trial account for you, upload all the Net Prospects records, and we'll set you up with 2,500 email credits. So you'd be all set up and ready to go. Actually, within 20 minutes, you can actually be sending a test email campaign out, to your Net Prospects records. If you have other records you want to upload, some of segment of an existing database you want to complement and try that, feel free to do so. But we'll give you a credit of 2,500 email credits that you can use with our system to try it out.
Great. I think we should jump right into the questions if we can. I know we're getting short on time.
Yep.
And I just saw an interesting one come in from Carol. And Carol is asking, I have been using a competitor to Pinpoint for about 2.5 years. Does switching email marketing services increase open and response rates? Do junk mail filters learn over time what to filter? Thanks.
Good question. So there are a lot of variables in that. The short answer is they can. It depends on a couple different variables. But the junk filters will look at things like what's the sending IP address. They'll look at the sender reputation of both your domain as well as potentially the, depending on how it's set up, potentially the sender, the email sender, your service provider rather. So they can look at a combination of those things. So without knowing, and I'm not suggesting you say who the vendor is, but as a general comment, it could be, I mean, if you're dealing with a vendor in particular that happens to have a reasonable mix of both B2B as well as business-to-consumer emails in their address base, across their customer base, then there's a reasonable likelihood, if you're a B2B company, that you may get a sort of a penalty, for lack of a better word, or the delivery rates might be a little more difficult for you because their domain might potentially end up getting some complaints and a hit against it for those B2C addresses. In our case, we don't really have any B2C. It's all B2B. The other aspect is whether or not you have a dedicated IP address, and there are some other things you can do to segment each customer, each business-to-business customer off from other customers so that one customer's reference or background doesn't impact another's. So the short answer is it could go up, depends on how they're doing things. And again, if they have a large mix of B2B as well as B2C data, then there's a reasonable likelihood that you might benefit in a delivery rate by coming to another vendor.
Let me ask you this, Craig. Do you guys offer static IP addresses for your customers?
Yes, we do. Yep, we have an option for doing static IP addresses for our business customers. Absolutely.
Okay. We had a question come in from Raj, and I'll answer this one. And the question is, will there be any problem with respect to the Can-Spam Act or customers not opting into our email list? And I don't know if Raj missed this in the beginning. We actually went over the 4 main provisions of the Can-Spam Act as it relates to business-to-business email. If your target list is to consumers, I can't comment on that. That's not my forte. But essentially, Raj, if you do abide by those 4 simple provisions, you should be okay. Certainly, customers or prospects can report your email as spam with their ISP or your own. In general, business emails that contain topical information to the recipient are received without many complaints. So if you're targeting your list or your list is targeted or segmented, you can actually probably minimize those opt-outs or any complaints that you might otherwise receive.
Yeah, and Carl, to add to that, what we recommend as best practices, let's suppose the customer or this person purchases a list from Net Prospects. Let's say they get 50,000 names from you, and they send those. You might send a series of, depending what you're doing, a series of campaigns over, let's say, 2 months. And then what I would do at the end of 2 months is you take a look at anybody who has not even opened an email, and you might want to send them one final email that just says, hey, you've not, we sent you correspondence, you haven't responded, haven't opened. Please click here if you'd like to stay subscribed to our list. Otherwise, we'll remove you. That's a safe best practices thing to do. And you'll find, as I said in my previous stat, we've looked at this very consistently, and I know from the data we have from you, is we'll see anywhere from 25 to 40% of that list that you purchased will still be, a very interactive, engaged, prospect list, and you remove the other piece that isn't.
Okay.
That aren't responding to emails.
We have a question here from James. Do you do email appending if we give you a list of companies, contacts, and addresses? And the short answer, or the easy answer, is yes, we do. We actually do some very detailed projects for customers with existing databases and doing a process that we call match and append. There's also, on the company level, the self-service append feature that I mentioned a few minutes ago, James. And we'd be happy to discuss that with you. I know we're short on time, and I want to get to as many as I can here.
Hey, Carl, here's one that actually came in that you already answered this, but worth stressing. The question is, did the information have titles and include email addresses? So again, email you just answered, but titles.
Oh, yes, of course.
Great.
This is probably for you. I don't know who this company is. How do you differentiate yourself from market to lead? Do you know who market to lead is?
I do. Now, that's a great question. And market to lead is more of a marketing automation where they do things like track on the website and so forth. So I'm reasonably familiar with market to lead and Eloqua and some of those. They're all very good products. I think the short answer for you in making your decision is, do you need and/or are you in a position to do full-blown marketing automation, which means, there's a bigger impact in terms of resources on your end to set stuff up and put tags on the website and so forth, and it's a different budget level. I mean, those products run anywhere from $2,500 to $7,000 or $10,000 per month, and in the case of Eloqua, for example, in most cases you also have to have a full-time employee, so it sort of looks like Siebel for marketing, if you will. They're great products. I'm a big fan. I've used them. Can't say enough good about them. The decision factor for you is, do you have kind of a couple $1,000 a month budget, or do you have a few $100 a month budget? Email marketing will typically run for us anywhere from $120 to $500 a month, depending on your list size, and that tends to be more the deciding criteria for folks. So I'm happy to follow up offline and give you some other vendors that you might want to look at if you're really ready to spend a couple $1,000s a month and do, full-blown marketing automation.
Okay. You have time for one more question, Craig?
Sure, I do.
Okay. This is from Elsa. When using purchase list, does that affect your sender reputation because these people are much more likely to hit the spam complaint, which would affect overall deliverability with your in-house list?
Actually, it's a great question, and I have a real metric on it. I'm glad you asked it, so I'll give you a comparison. And this is out of our own data. So when we look at I'll give you 3 different sets of metrics. When we look at our B2B customers who are sending emails to B2B recipients, okay, the email complaint ratio we have, or the spam complaint ratio that we have across all of our customers, virtually all of whom use purchase lists, runs between 1 in 12,000 and 1 in 40,000 emails that are sent. So I know with our list, we're right in the middle of that. We've worked with net prospects. Our spam complaint rates are running about 1 per 30,000. That's for Pinpoint for our own efforts. So there's some real metrics for you. In the middle of the pack, what an ISP carrier would like to see is a rate of no more than 1 per 5,000. So our B2B customers are way above that, using a mix of regular and purchase lists. I'll give you another data point, is if you look at B2C, we've done some sort of experiment, so to speak, with a couple B2C customers where we've segmented them off into a completely different part of the network, if you will. And those spam complaint ratios we've seen have gotten to above 1 per 100. So they're completely different metrics, which is exactly why a Constant Contact or some of the others have to have a policy that you cannot use an opt-in list, because they have to service, that you can't use a purchase list, because they service B2B as well as B2C. And those B2C ratios that are 30 to 50 times more prominent than our B2B customers, huge ratio. Those B2C customers sort of pollute, if you will, overall the delivery rates that a Constant Contact or other company has to deal with. Again, they have good products. That's the fact of life when they have to deal with both B2B as well as B2C. So the short answer is, in summary, in concept, yes, that's a viable question. In reality, and we've got real data and lots of data behind it, millions and millions of emails. The email rates in purchase lists for B2B, if you're sort of a good citizen and you follow the canned spam laws and some best practices, we see spam complaint rates 1 per 12,000 to 1 per 40,000, which is very, very acceptable.
Okay. There were a ton of questions we simply do not have time to get to here today, but of course we will respond to each question that did come in via phone or email. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Craig, thank you very much. I think this has been a very insightful webinar. Based on the attendance, there's definitely an interest in B2B email marketing.
Great, thank you. And what we'll do is, in fact, we'll take the questions, and when we send a follow-up, that's why one of the reasons it'll take an extra day or so, but early next week we'll send a follow-up with pricing information from both of us, as well as we'll take the majority of the Q&A, and we'll have a separate sheet with the question and answers for all the people, and we'll answer those. And so you'll see all the questions and answers in addition to the ones we didn't get to speak to specifically today.
Great. Thanks again, everyone, for your time today. We definitely appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Craig.